Hey guys, so I wanted to talk about chapter 34. It is going to be managing wetlands for wildlife. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about what wetlands are and define them, and all the different ways to plan and manage for them, what's going to be found on them, all that good stuff. So, we talked about how in the beginning of the chapter that wetlands are complex. They want to talk about different types of classifications, um, and that traditionally the history of wetlands and all that good stuff. We're going to get into it. But in the end, we're going to talk about how the protection has actually happened now, more recently in the last couple decades, of the protection, restoration, and enhancement of wetlands in the United States. But we'll talk about the history before and how that didn't happen. But we do have places like national wildlife refuges, state management areas, wetland wild reserve programs, non-government organizations, Ducks Unlimited. Maybe some of y'all have heard of that one. The Nature Conservancy. I hope y'all have heard of that one. There's a place in Alabama where I'm from. My dad left some land to, I think it was called Forever Wild, and it was in the Mobile River Basin there. So lots of different organizations in charge of preserving different types of wetland. And so, yeah, 560 national wildlife refuges and 38 different wetland management districts. The history, it wasn't great. It wasn't great for wetlands way back in the day. I want to say it talked about in the past, there were, do I have it in here? I don't have it in here, but I have it in the chapter outlines. I think it said pre-colonial days, there was so much wetlands. And then by the time we hit the 1940s, 50s, I think it was, I think we were down to like 5% of what we used to have as far as wetlands pre-colonial days, and now present day. So let's talk about a little bit of history. Some of the things that led to our destruction of the wetlands was the Swamplands Act that also promoted drainage and reclamation. A lot of these are promoting drainage and reclamation. We have the Rivers and Harbors Act also in the 1800s, and this was they regulated navigable waterways. So if you could make it through, it was all right to completely destroy it in the name of getting boat traffic through. Then we had some that actually started to preserve and help out the wetlands, and this was in the 1930s. So we got the Migratory Bird Hunting Stamp Act, that's going to help actually acquire and restore wetlands. So this was 1930s, but then it was balanced, of course, with the Water Protection and Flood Prevention Act, which also increased drainage of the wetlands near flood control protection areas. The USDA also subsidized draining of the wetlands. One of our big protectors of the wetlands more recently in the 70s, was it first established, was the Clean Water Act. It had a much longer name, but we just know it today as the Clean Water Act. And this is still our primary mechanism of protection for wetlands. It established the migratory bird rule, and that meant that it's going to include all of the, like you think, navigable waterways that are going to lead into navigable waterways, but also isolated spots of wetlands. And that's the migratory bird rule. The migratory birds are going to use all of the wetlands, whether they are attached to, a moving swamp that's going to eventually lead its way out into the ocean or not. That's the migratory bird rule. And so there are different amendments over the course of time for the Clean Water Act. And it also mentioned that it is still being argued in courts. I think there were some amendments that got rolled back during the Trump presidency. And then I think in the Biden presidency, they got put back in place. But the Clean Water Act is still our primary means of protection. We currently don't have any sort of overarching federal rule on specifics on wetlands, which would be great. Let's talk about some more stuff we've gotten here. The Farm Security Act, the Swamp Buster provision. So a lot of the wetlands were drained for agriculture, for production of food. And some of them, they would drain the land and drain these swamps and build these massive fields. And then they would keep like one little pond area and claim that that's the wetlands for the area. This still happens today. There was a creek behind my neighborhood originally, and that property got sold, and that creek has been sort of diverted into storm drainage and then into a, not retention pond, but a detention pond next to the neighborhood. And it is absolutely not recreating the creek and natural woodlands that were there. So it's kind of similar to that Farm Security Act that's happening still current day. The Emergency Wetland Resource Act helped purchase more wetlands and establish the National Wetlands Priority Conservation Plan. Leading us to the 90s Water Resources Development Act and the U.S. Natural Resources Conservation Service. All right, moving on. Defining the wetlands. What is a wetland? So it is hard to define with a single definition, but we are going to skip over. It talks about all the different things that you can find in a wetland, that they are, going to occur oftentimes with river systems. They might have along a body of water. But as far as this chapter is concerned, the textbook says that they are going to go with the definition that wetlands are transitional areas between terrestrial land and aquatic systems, where the water table is usually at or near the surface, or the land is already covered by shallow water. So these are that's the textbook definition that it says that it's going to go with throughout this chapter. But it does talk about how there is specific term jurisdictional definitions of a wetland. It was in multiple different categories, but there was one, I think it wasn't the USDA, but it was one of the organizations that it uses to classify different types of wetlands. Here we are in our classification. The U.S. Forest Service, that's what it was, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has the most useful standard for identifying classifying wetlands. Primary factors used to classify the wetlands are geomorphing, the water source, and hydrodynamics. Distribution. Here we go. Here's the stats from I knew we had it in here somewhere. From the colonial times, 11% of the landscape in the United States were wetlands, estimated. And the estimate of the exact hectares was about a little under 90 million hectares back in the day in the 1600s. But now currently, since about the 1980s, we are down to, instead of 11% of the landscape, 5% of the landscape, only 5% now. Why? Because of all the things that we talked about before, that you could just drain the swamps and you could build your farm. You were actually encouraged by the USDA to do so. You could drain the swamps and develop the land for property and residential, all sorts of different reasons for people to drain the land, because in the past, up until the 1930s, wetlands were just considered nuisance land. They were useless, and that was just the thoughts back then. But now we know better. Yeah, here we are. All the different reasons: flood control, transportation, communication network, disease prevention, because swamps breed invertebrates, and some of those invertebrates spread diseases. All sorts of reasons. The impacts of that loss, tons. So much that we can't actually really measure. We measured the loss in hectares, but like the actual impact of all of the different things that we are missing out because we've lost that much wetlands, it's immeasurable. We have documentation of different types of decreases in specific species that we have measured. So it mentioned the shorebird conservation, and in the shorebird conservation, there's 50 species mentioned, 50 shorebird species mentioned, and of those 50 species, 5 of them are highly imperiled, 22 of them are of high concern, and 15% are moderate concern. So a large portion of those shorebird species are at least in some level of concern, and the same goes for the waterbird conservation plan as well. Wetland functions and values. Back in the day, again, we thought wetlands were useless. We just needed to change that land into something more useful. Farmland, homes, housing, roads, transportation, whatever that may be. But now we know that they do serve a purpose. They are going to have biological things that live there, abiotic stuff that happens there, chemical processes, all that good stuff that happens in wetlands. The most widely valued wetland function is providing habitat for wildlife, because this class is about wildlife, and contributing to the maintenance of biodiversity. So a lot of our species that are threatened and endangered, it said 43% of them require wetlands at some point in their life cycle. 43% of the threatened and endangered species require wetlands. And 50% of the migratory birds that are going back and forth absolutely require wetlands in their migratory patterns. Wetlands are going to support 31% of the plant species occurring in the US, 5%, and compose only 5% again of the land surface because it used to be 11% and now it's 5. They can absolutely positively impact water storage, an area to put all of that water when heavy rains go to help mitigate flooding. They can reduce sediment and nutrient loading. They improve stream water quality when they kind of act as sieves. They act as like natural filters. So they're going to improve stream water quality, contribute to groundwater recharge. I don't know if anybody's ever seen pictures or had the experience of a natural pool instead of like a chlorine-based or saltwater-based treatment of a pool. If you've ever seen pictures of natural pools where they're using biotic factors and abiotic factors to maintain the water quality, the wetlands do that naturally. They do that naturally. So they are going to recharge the groundwater, improve the groundwater, sequester carbon, absolutely, and improve plant biodiversity. So they have lots of different wonderful qualities about them that we did not appreciate back in the day. Characteristics, again, the living and the non-living stuff, the abiotic stuff and the biotic stuff. Abiotic stuff, hydro period, the climate in the area. Speaking of climate, wetlands are really helpful in climate change. We are getting more and more severe storms, and the wetlands act as storm surge protectors. Those areas that we have in the Mississippi River Delta, for example, help protect the areas that are very low lying when storm surges come from hurricanes. Same with mangrove forests, all of those help protect against the increasing events that we are seeing with climate change. They help with soil. They're going to have abiotic factors, disturbances like fires that blow through. Biotic stuff are going to be all the things that live there, the big stuff and the little stuff, the algae, the bacteria, the amphibians, the lizards, the birds, of course, because we're definitely going to talk about water birds. So we got to think about all these characteristics, the living stuff, the non-living stuff, when we go into planning, which is going to be our next topic. Here's our stuff in a diagram where we got the living stuff, the non-living stuff, and how it all goes in a big cycle. So we got the woody vegetation, the herbaceous vegetation, so the brown stuff and the green stuff, and how that is all eaten up by the vertebrates that are going to be our herbivores. Our invertebrates also feed up on this stuff, and eventually they will decompose. The plant life will decompose into litter, and that's going to affect the soil nutrients, the water quality, and we cycle all around with all of this good stuff. Other considerations and characteristics, geomorphology, absolutely. So here is our picture of the US and the different types of landforms, everything from the prairies kind of up in the Great Lakes region to, I am more familiar with my home area, lower Mississippi Valley. Out west, we've got the Colorado Plateau up there, and then basin and range on the more Pacific mountain range over here with the Sierras and the why am I thinking, I'm blanking on it, Rocky Mountain range over here. Things that are going to impact our geomorphology. What happened back in the day? Like, where are our tectonic plates? Are they moving and shifting? Where were the glaciers? Do we still have glaciers? Some of these areas actually do still have glaciers, like up in upper Montana, and my favorite national park has glaciers. Where are things undergoing weathering? Are they undergoing erosion? Speaking of erosion, when that stuff gets eroded and it eventually settles out, where is it going to deposit that stuff? Yeah, tectonic activity, glaciation, all of that is into consideration. That sets us up for the type of land that we're looking at and the type of soils that we're looking at. Is it a glacier that used to be there and it melted, and now all of this is the settling out of where the glacier used to be? Is this a very high plateau situation where we got a lot of wind and a lot of erosion happening? What is the type of geology in the area that can impact the soils? What is the hydrology in the area and the climate? So it talks about precipitation, the rain coming down, the groundwater and how it's going to precipitate down and get into the groundwater and hopefully into aquifers down below. There's also surface water that we need to take into consideration. And of course, if this is going on to our coastlines, tidal fluctuations and how that's going to impact our wetland. So those would be sources of water coming in. And then we got outflow where water is leaving the system, evaporation when water, like when you sweat and your sweat is going to evaporate into gas and cool you down, evaporation. And then there's transpiration. I know we talk about this in 1108 for those of y'all who've had that class, where plants are going to suck up water from the soil and the little water molecules are going to go up through the plant vessels, and it's going to evaporate out the top of the plant, out of its stomata possibly. So transpiration is the water moving through the plants and then evaporating out. So that both of those are going to be our outputs in the system. Other important components, the algae in the system, is it in balance, or did we have some sort of pollution, heavy pollution that's coming in, and it is causing eutrophication? Maybe we had a huge dump of nitrogen or phosphorus, and now we got a huge eutrophication situation going on. Algae blooms, sucks up all the oxygen in the area, and then it kills off everything that relied on that oxygen in those surrounding areas. Algae is super important. And hopefully it maintains balance in that wetland. Vascular vegetation, the plants. So I stole this out of the textbook where you can see some common wetland plants listed in here, and then where we're going to find them, and then how valuable are they for different types of ducks or invertebrates. So you can see like one plus mark all the way to 3+ marks for the value of their seeds for ducks or their quality of plant for invertebrates. Other components are the macroinvertebrates that we were just talking about. And you can see those guys, some of those guys anyway, listed over here on the left. Remember, we talked about some people with drain swamps because they didn't want to deal with mosquitoes and being vectors. So that is definitely one of the invertebrates to consider, but also don't forget about all the other invertebrates that live in there, all the different types of water bugs, all of y'all that are taking, is it invertebrate ecology, water ecology? The Jason Christian's class. Y'all know all about this. Y'all know all about this. And then the other stuff on the right-hand side, it's all about plant decomposition, and that's the cycle of life and how the invertebrates and vertebrates factor into the decomposition in this cycle over here. So we've got litter decomposition and the pathway of its nutrients through the cycle of life. Other wetland vertebrates this time. So we had a list of invertebrates on the last side. Here's some of our vertebrates. And so it's talking about the different types of wetlands, different types of ponds, lakes, and then we have the different animals that might be found in those different types of wetlands. Everything from dabbling ducks, like your, oh my gosh, why can't I think of just a basic duck? A mallard. Or your shorebirds, your plovers, sandpipers, your waders, maybe your egrets, all those guys, all these different types of vertebrates, even frogs and all that good stuff, are going to use these different types of wetlands. Blackbirds, chickadees, frogs, jays, kingbirds, and fin ponds. I was telling you, I think last week, about how we have red-winged blackbirds nesting in our pond right now. On the Cartersville campus right off the parking lot. There's at least one red-winged blackbird nest, if not two, in the reeds right on that little bitty pond. And there's several nesting in the pond up at the front by Highway 20. Vertebrate foraging depths, you can see the different types of vertebrate listed on the left-hand side and how far down they may go as far as centimeters into the water to forage. And you can see some of them go much deeper than others, like the little sandpipers that just stay pretty much on, getting little things really close to the surface. And then we've got dietary changes of mallards or dabbling ducks. Dietary changes based on the season. So you can see they may eat a lot of seeds and invertebrates in the fall and the autumn, and then in the springtime, they may change to different types of invertebrates, more forest dwellers versus the marsh dwellers back in the fall. More vertebrates continued. Again, the amphibians, all the other types of things that aren't just birds, the amphibians and the reptiles that are also calling the wetlands home. Wetland planning. Planning is definitely going to be critical to management. We want to make sure that we are thinking about all the things and trying to consider the big picture as a whole instead of just trying to, it mentioned that planning is often approached as an obstacle in the place of grant funding. So you want to get your grant, so you got to plan your management plan. And oftentimes people rush the plan and don't actually get the proper outcomes that they were hoping for because they didn't plan properly. So here's our planning process. What's our purpose for our management plan? What do we hope to see? What's our vision? What is our broad open-ended goal? Open-ended goal. We'd like to preserve this habitat and possibly get it back to the way it was. Maybe, that's our vision, and our broad open-ended goal would be to increase the I don't know, the waterfowl population of this area. What's our objectives with precise, measurable, achievable goals? If we are trying to have measurable, achievable goals, if we were looking at specific shorebird populations or wetland populations, and then what's our strategy? How are we going to get to and achieve those objectives? On our management, wetland management, hopefully we are using the planning approach that we talked about with our hierarchy. If there was ever any pristine wetlands, and it talked about how in the textbook most of the wetlands have been manipulated in some way by us, but if there are pristine wetlands, we are trying to not really manage them with a heavy hand. We want to just passively manage those things. Things that we want to consider in our design and management is, do we need to construct anything? Do we need to build levees? Do we need to manage the water in this situation, add water to, or drain water out of an area? How are we going to configure this? So it does mention levee construction that we've got over here on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side where we put those levees. And if we put the levees with the contours of the land, you could see on the left-hand side is 100% effective management, where you can absolutely try and get the optimal water depth. And if we did not put our levees with the contours and put them across the contours, then you can see that it's not managed the same. So we're going to have 45% effective management. Here are some examples of water control structures where we've got the screw gate, water control, where we are going to have the little thing at the top. We'll twist it, and then that's going to open the flow at the bottom. And then you've also got the stop log water control structure. So that brings us to the end of this chapter. Let me know if you have any questions.